In this video, I'll contrast what I understand to be Lazaris's paradigm around negative ego as an identity that's sole goal is to destroy us, that always lies, etc., and the internal family systems model of thinking pioneered by Richard Schwartz. So Lazaris posits that the negative ego is, I guess, part of the ego, that we need an ego, but that there's this part of the ego that is the negative ego. There's the positive ego and the negative ego. And I would first of all suggest that that is to some extent incorrect. That if you look at the pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that is an identity. That is an identity, and the ego is that which attaches itself to a pattern, to identity. That every single pattern is better than something and worse than something else, right? And so the idea that there's a good pattern and a bad pattern, a constructive pattern and a destructive pattern, is always relative. You know, that's one thing. And the other thing I would posit is that the patterns that we have are the most intelligent patterns we are capable of generating. The other thing that I would posit is that, Lazaris makes the distinction between self-I and ego-I. But where does the power lie? Meaning, if the self gives the power to the ego, or a parent gives the authority to the child, who's responsible? Like, do you hold the child accountable, or do you hold the self accountable? This is one of the actually more kind of interesting dilemmas in this space, is this kind of dynamic where self-energy is always positive, but it isn't viewed as positive, right? Self-energy can be viewed as a threat by the culture, by abusive parents, for example. If a child has a strong self-I, that can trigger in greater intensities of violence by abusive parents, right? And in that way, the self becomes the enemy of the protective identities. In other words, if you get traumatized more by bringing self, you could think of that in larger historic terms. I don't remember if it was Joan of Arc or... Yeah, there was a French seer. I forget her name. But basically, she was a threat to the chauvinism and the power structure of the Catholic Church. So precisely because she was so beautifully embodying self, she was killed. And when ego identities, patterns designed for survival, security of survival, love and belonging, understand that the self represents a threat to the body, and that turns out to be the case. What do you make of that? Like, is the self-energy good, but not good enough to transform its environment? But either way, right? The self is doing an inadequate job of holding space for for self energy for the ego to take over. And the culture is doing an inadequate job of providing a safe space for self energy so that ego needs to take over to survive. I'm not sure I would attribute fault to the ego, though. You can attribute fault to the cult or culture. You can attribute fault to the self. You can attribute fault to the ego. You can attribute fault to space-time. You can attribute fault to God got us all that is. You can't have a fault within a piece of God got us all that is that doesn't extend to God got us all that is. So there is a lot of, there's a lot of conceptual effort to divide the one into pieces and then pretend that this piece is good and this piece is bad, when in reality, you cannot have one without the other. And so I tend to think that the most effective paradigms, if they include fault, distribute the fault equally in the dynamic. So anyway, but nevertheless, Lazaris says there is an ego, you need an ego. There's a negative ego and a positive ego. And then he says this is the negative ego and this is the positive ego. And one of the characteristics of the negative ego is that the ego always lies. The ego never tells the truth. The negative ego always lies. Well, the positive ego always lies as well. No one has ever heard anything absolutely true in language, because language is an approximate symbol, right? So anytime you're thinking, basically, your thoughts are a lie, right? Thoughts are constructed out of words, which are made in an artificial grid that is superimposed on all that is, right? So the first thing about words is they're vastly simplistic, right? But the second, that's the first lie, right? I mean, you call this red, right? But there are 256 million colors. So which red is this? And it's not really red. It's all different shades of, this and that with different shadows and all that. So it's a very, 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 very crude symbol of a very complex pattern, right? It's not the pattern. It's a very crude symbol, right? So when you apply a crude symbol on a complex pattern, it's not real. It's not true. It's just taking you in a very general area of truth. And then the second thing that we do with words, right, is we say that this is red and, that's purple, right? It's bullshit, right? We cut up reality into a grid with words, and then we construct our thoughts with those words. But the dividing line, right? The dividing line between that purple and that red, there is no sharp line. We just call that purple and we call this red, creating the illusion that there's a partition between this word and this word. There isn't. The partitions aren't real. There has never been a human thought, whether Lazaris said it, I said it, or anyone else said it, that is real or that is true, right? Now you have truer, like that is more purple and this is more red, but it's not true, right? The only thing that that can really hint at the truth is all words are symbolic, crude lies that take you in perhaps a closer direction or in a further direction. So the negative ego always lies, so does the positive ego. Number one. Number two, there's no distinction between the two. If the positive ego was so positive, then why hasn't it healed the negative ego, right? The ego is just I that has attached itself to identity, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, right? And if the positive pattern was so positive, why didn't it heal and love the negative pattern, right? If it didn't, it's not all that positive, right? So, right? So why attribute, the negative, etc.? But the other thing is, and this is kind of Lazaris' acknowledgement of this after talking endlessly for thousands of hours. Lazaris said all beliefs are false, so pick the ones that work. Everything Lazaris says is false, but maybe some of the things that he has said work better than others, but not absolute. There will be something that works better than anything Lazaris says. May not be now, may not be in this place, we may or may not have heard it, but all patterns, right? All repeated thoughts, that's what a cassette tape is or whatever, all patterns of energy in some way are fixed, right? Once you make a recording, it's a fixed pattern. And there will be growth beyond that pattern, and there will be growth below and beneath that, and less than that pattern, right? And so it's a fixed pattern, and it's better than some things, and it's worse than others, right? The reptilian brain, with its fight, flight, freeze paradigm of sociopathic activity, was a huge advancement at some point, and still is a huge advancement in certain reptilian environments. Meaning if you are surrounded by reptiles, practicing the sociopathic edict of fight and take from what is smaller than you, run from what is bigger than you, and freeze when neither of those two are expedient, and ass lick to people in power that will protect you as long as you prostitute yourself to them. If you are in that environment in a pervasive way, right, then using your reptilian instincts will help you survive in that environment long enough, perhaps to outlive the environment or move out of it, and then you can explore your metaphysics, right? So the reptilian code is still not purely negative. Now, if you have an empathic group and you are capable of being in an empathic operating system, empathic is better than reptilian. If you're in an empathic group, if you have the skill, the competence to create that, then the human or empathic operating system of who's in the most pain, how can we help? Right? If there is someone in massive pain in your circle and nobody is responding to it, you're in a reptilian operating system. You're in a reptilian group. Now, they may buy tapes and talk about forgiveness and self-love and all that. But if the person inside or outside in the most pain is being marginalized, isolated, dismissed, etc., and not getting group attention in a way that facilitates sustainable well-being, you're in a sociopathic operating system that may be masquerading as aren't we spiritual, etc. We just bury our shame, our reptilian behavior under the carpet, right? And reptiles are great at performance, right? They just don't believe it's a performance. But if you're in a reptilian environment with reptilian operating, protocols, it can help you survive or level the playing field, right? If you're generous with sociopaths, you can end up being hurt severely. So that anyway, that there is a negative ego that's completely separate from the positive ego. That doesn't really hold up, under scrutiny. That something is absolutely negative without without it having a reference point or a context also doesn't hold up, right? Germans ate leather boots to survive famine, right? Is that disgusting or is that intelligent survival? It's context dependent. It's context dependent, right? And the great Western powers and all this stuff, right? Were as sociopathic to the Germans as the Germans were sociopathic to, everyone else, right? There's no great, moral high ground, in how that played out, right? We like to do it, say, oh, that's the bad person and all that, right? But that just perpetuates the cycle, right? The Second World War emerged out of the cruelty of the First World War, but the cruelty on all sides, the shaming on all sides, but, the Germans were left carrying the bag, right? So we can learn and own that, or we can blame and scapegoat a small part, right? So it's probably healthier to look at the idea of the destructive aspects of ego as the scapegoat that's been left holding the bag rather than the villain, right, that needs to be, busted and, pulled apart and all that. There is a role for discipline, but if we look at the IFS model, right, so that's Lazaris's model, and frankly, I have never met a Lazaris friend who has done anything good with it. I have never, ever met anyone who has done something good with that model. Now, Bill Brown will, former Concept Synergy employee for decades, will talk about how Penny, and her gang, the Orlando gang, got together and they were going to bust his ego, which Lazaris doesn't advise. But that tells you we're off course right away, right? If Lazaris's closest friend can't follow the protocol, I'm going to bust your ego rather than bust my own, right? That tells you something's awry, right? But it didn't work, right? They got together, we're going to bust your ego. They called his girlfriend and shamed him, right? We're going to bust his ego. And what? Nothing, right? So, Lazaris's big claim that their techniques work is destructive when they don't, but people hold on to that idea, right? They're constructive when they work, for the times that they work. And that's one of the reasons that I'm a proponent of Concept Synergy taking the ethical stance of sending out a detailed survey to everyone who's ever been a client and inviting a statistical collage by gender, by age, by working with different techniques on how many times have you done the 33-second technique? How many times have you noticed a difference? Is it the most effective technique you've done for manifesting? You'd quickly get data sets. 10% of people think it's a great technique based on working more than 50% of the time, or 70%. How many people try goals and action plans and get those? And what's the difference between, does it work at a resonance level but not at a manifesting level, or a manifesting level not at a resonance level? For example, I've used goals and action plans to achieve, 5,000 goals, something along those lines. And it works, it accelerates my meaningful accomplishments by 400%. but it doesn't increase my happiness in the long run, right? So that's an important distinction, right? Because the reason I do goals is I thought that if I saved up and made this money and achieved this and I did that, I thought that I would experience more sustainable well-being. But I do not, right? And so it's very effective at creating, success in the sense of, the outcomes I'm desiring. But the reason I was interested in those outcomes was to experience more love and well-being, and that hasn't happened. I'm more impatient and irritable and have more symptoms of PTSD than I did before achieving those 5,000 goals. Right? So what to make of that, right? And so that's an important distinction, which would be good. So maybe people using the 33-second technique don't achieve hardly anything, but they feel good, right? And so that would be the deeper goal, right? So in that sense, you might say, well, the whole point of the goal is to feel good. So I feel good when I'm doing the 33-second technique. It doesn't work to create the reality, but it works to create the sense of well-being. Or does it create massive self-pity? Like, what am I doing it wrong? I keep doing this thing. Lazaris says it's so powerful. Oh, gosh, I don't want anyone to know. I am not aware. I do the 33-second technique every couple of days on the morning tape. I am not aware of ever seeing any connection between my outer reality and that. So what I've switched to doing, rather than just going through the martyrhood of, visualizing things that never happen, when I can just make an action plan and make them happen if I want to, is I do 33-second techniques with states, where I get in touch with a state and I feel that state. And I could give a shit about the reality. It's like, who cares? I don't want, this, and this. I want to feel like this. So let's just focus on that feeling. And it works in that I feel that way during the 33-second technique, which is more than I would feel that way if, I didn't do it at all, right? And so that's a great success. And it is an improvement over trying to visualize what Lazaris is suggesting, because not only have I never been able to notice a correlation between the 33-second technique and that, I have never met a Lazaris friend who is getting, I think Lazaris says you should see a really dynamic movement in your reality within 3 days. I don't know anyone who's doing that, right? And of course, everyone would be doing that if all you had to do was visualize, money, whatever it is, in 33 seconds, or the ideal lover, or whatever it is that you think is worthwhile, or world peace. Everyone would be doing it, right? But it's when there's no noticeable result, other than maybe what did I do wrong this time? Why do it, right? And that, I think, correlates significantly with the decline in kind of concept synergy clientele, right? If you've got the best technique at really, frankly, affordable prices, then everyone's going to do it, right? So anyway, that what IFS does, internal family systems, starts with a different notion altogether. It says that when you were being raped at 2 years old, when you were listening to your mom being abused, when you were this and that it was so traumatic for you as an infant, as a child, when you were being bullied at school, etc., that this traumatic pain was overwhelming painful, lonely, and you felt helpless. And you are a kid in an environment with inadequate adulthood, with inadequate adults, right? If you've got adequate adults, you are not chronically traumatized. Now, let's be very clear on that. So you have inadequate adults that are not protecting an infant, a child, etc., from terrifying, traumatic experiences. And so the kid has nothing but their own inner personas, their own to try and protect themselves. Because they're not being shown role models of love, whatever, one of the things that is the most effective way to go from traumatic loneliness, so you have you have the misery, you have trauma, you're alone, and you're helpless. I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed. Of course, it's trauma. I'm alone. Now, when a part of you comes forward, the critical parent, a new part, a self-harming part comes forward. You're no longer alone. You've got another part responding. So you've got the loneliness going away. Now, when you, for example, harm yourself, you're no longer helpless. You are actively empowered. You're doing the pain. And so if you can cause yourself enough pain to distract yourself from the pain that other people are causing that you're helpless around, your helplessness goes down, your loneliness goes down, your power goes up, your sense that I am here goes up, and sometimes your trauma goes down as well. And the reason for that is that sociopathic abusers that want to give their pain to their children, when their children will cause themselves a certain amount of pain, right? So, for example, the child breaks the vase, the parent is going to have a fit and hit the child, but then the child falls down the stairs and breaks their neck. Well, suddenly the parent doesn't hurt them, they run to the hospital. And so now you don't have a giant trying to kill you. You've made an effort to do that. Now the giant is trying to help you. So you've actually bypassed the worst trauma of all, which is that your giant parents are trying to kill you by self-harming, right? And so once this new dentity, this coping dentity comes in, this pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being, that gives agency, that takes power, and that prevents outside pain by causing inside pain, right? There is a huge increase in state. And then you go to the hospital, you're getting attention from your giant, etc., which you didn't get when you were in a healthy state. Wow. So what IFS, internal family systems therapy, says is that yes, there are definite patterns in you that are self-destructive, that are self-harming, that are doing this and this and this, out of love, out of necessity, right? As the best thing that a 5-year-old could come up with. And that in a traumatically illiterate cult or culture, in a psychologically illiterate cult, you are not learning to untangle and rework those patterns. And yourself, like your parents, is dropping, right? It's dropping the ball. Yourself isn't coming in and saying, gee, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you, and I'm sorry I got you into trouble, and I'm sorry you had to get rid of me, etc., and I apologize. The self isn't doing that, right? So is that the ego's fault or the self's fault, right? And the parent isn't modeling that. Is that the child's fault or the parent's fault, right? So to the extent that there's negative anything, it's negative all around, right? Lazaris is offering incompetent techniques and an incompetent paradigm. We're doing a terrible job of implementing them. The role models were terrible. The past generations was terrible, et cetera, and Lazaris is just saying, why did you create this and why did you create that, and that often just adds shame to the dynamic, right? So if there's negativity there, right, and this was God, Goddesses, all that is grander plan. If there's negativity there, it's an empath. An effective protocol is not to scapegoat it and blame it all on the negative ego or this or that, the other, or on the bad seed in the family, but to look at the whole system and look at what weight each part of the system is able and willing to take back, right? And if it isn't, right, then don't blame the tomato for withering. Look at the gardener that isn't watering it, right? Or look at the paradigm that's ineffective. If you tell a tomato, grow and then I'll give you some water as a reward, you've got a faulty map, right? Is that the tomato's fault or the gardener's fault, right? So I would highly recommend checking out the internal family systems therapy paradigm. There's a great book, There Are No Bad Parts. A 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old, will do any number of things that facilitate an improvement of state, maybe going from powerlessness to power. Now, I'm causing the pain to myself. I'm cutting. I'm not waiting around in terror to be whipped. I'm causing the pain. It feels good. I've got the power, right? So, and one of the things that I've been increasingly aware of is the drama parts in me that cause crisis so that I will not be peaceful, because I think I want a peaceful state. But the crisis-causing part knows that I don't know how to deal with certain terrifying feelings that come up and the body sensations that come with them, right? Because I'm a psychologically illiterate person, raised in a psychologically illiterate cult, right, with spiritual bypassing examples right and left, and I don't know what the fuck I'm doing, right? And that part is worried, right, about suicide. It's worried about various things, and it's like, let's just create some drama or sabotage this so that things don't get that peaceful, because those sensations start to bubble up, those feelings start to bubble up, and that could kill us. We got to do something, right? And it's a 5-year-old running that show that never got re-educated. And so you can say the negative ego wants to destroy you, but that actually doesn't hold up. It doesn't work as well, right? Unlike, the yet to be heard story of the person that created wonderful things using the busting and building ego tape, there are a huge percentage of story after story after story of highly suicidal people with addictions and this and that and the other that managed to get through horrific childhood environments, right, and come out the other side without blaming any of their parts, right? So all beliefs are false. Pick the ones that work. IFS works 10 times better than any of Lazaris' techniques on ego on a statistical basis, right? And if anyone wants to contest that, where's the data, right? Because really good programs like IFS, they gather data and they talk about their failings and they talk about what's this, right? That's the opportunity for concept synergy or Lazaris to care enough about their friends to follow that best practice, to gather and share data about what works, what doesn't, and to continue the iteration process, continue to grow the process to get better results.